The first indication that something was wrong came from the outer system monitoring stations. Chief Petty Officer Harris was halfway through his routine sensor sweep when the displays went dark, one by one, in perfect sequence. It took him nearly 30 seconds to realize what he was seeing. "Sir!" he called to the watch commander. "We're losing contact with the picket stations." Commander William Torres hurried over to the sensor console, his coffee mug forgotten on his desk. The tactical display showed the Tau Ceti system's defensive network as a web of green dots, but even as he watched, more and more of them winked out of existence. "Communication failure?" Torres asked hopefully. "Negative, sir. These are hard kills. Someone's taking out our early warning grid." Torres felt his blood run cold. The monitoring stations were heavily shielded and equipped with the latest defensive systems. Taking them out would require significant firepower and intimate knowledge of their locations. "Sound General Quarters," he ordered. "And get me a direct line to Admiral Reyes." The alarm klaxons began wailing throughout the orbital command station as Torres tried to process what he was seeing. The pattern of station failures suggested a coordinated attack by multiple strike groups, which meant this wasn't a raid by pirates or mercenaries. This was a military operation. But who would be crazy enough to attack a hegemony stronghold? His question was answered 20 minutes later when the first wave of Loyalist ships emerged from hyperspace at the edge of the system's gravity well. The sensor display suddenly bloomed with new contacts, more ships than Torres had ever seen in one place, all bearing the energy signatures of Imperial Navy vessels. "My God!" he breathed. "Get me the planetary governor. Now." Admiral Kira Voss stood on the bridge of the Defiance as her ship dropped out of hyperspace into the Tau Ceti system. Around her, the rest of the Loyalist fleet materialized from the quantum foam in a carefully orchestrated sequence, their hulls scarred and patched but their weapons systems glowing with lethal energy. "Sensor sweep complete," reported Lieutenant Okafor. 57 hegemony vessels detected, including 3 heavy battle stations. They're forming defensive positions around the planet. "Signal from Admiral Chen," Torres announced. "His battle group is engaging the orbital defenses now." On the main view screen, Kira could see the distant flashes of weapons fire as Chen's ships opened their attack on the hegemony battle stations. The converted merchant vessels and aging cruisers that made up his force were no match for the enemy's frontline warships, but they were buying time for the real mission. "Take us in," Kira ordered. "All ships, this is Admiral Voss. Begin Operation Reckoning." The strike group consisted of 20 fast attack craft built for planetary assault, destroyers and frigates with enhanced shields and atmospheric flight capability. They drove straight toward Kepler 442b while the hegemony fleet moved to intercept, their formation tight and disciplined despite the overwhelming odds they faced. The first hegemony fighters reached them as they crossed the orbit of the system's outermost moon. 12 squadrons of advanced interceptors, their sleek hulls bristling with plasma cannons and missile pods. They came in fast and hard, trying to break up the Loyalist formation before it could reach the planet. "Launching fighters," reported the flight deck controller. "All squadrons away." The void around the Defiance suddenly filled with the angular shapes of Imperial fighters, their pilots veterans of a dozen battles who had somehow survived the fall of the Empire. They met the hegemony interceptors head-on in a swirling dogfight that painted the darkness with weapons fire. Lieutenant Commander Sarah Kim, call sign Valkyrie, led Red Squadron in a diving attack on the enemy formation. Her fighter was an old Mark 7 Falcon, held together by spare parts and determination, but it could still dance among the stars when properly handled. "Red leader to all units," she called over the radio. "Remember, we're not here to win a fighter battle. We're here to clear a path. Stay focused on the mission." Her squadron dove through a formation of hegemony interceptors, their guns blazing as they tried to punch a hole in the enemy defensive screen. 2 of her fighters were hit in the first pass, their hulls venting atmosphere as they spun out of control, but the rest pressed on toward the planet. Behind the fighters, Admiral Voss's strike group continued its high-speed approach to Kepler 442b. The planet grew larger in their viewports with each passing minute, a blue-green world that had once been a jewel of the Empire and was now just another conquered territory in the hegemony's vast domain. Planetary defense batteries are coming online, Okafor reported. I'm reading 47 heavy gun emplacements around New Geneva. Kira nodded grimly. Even if they made it through the orbital defenses, they would still have to run a gauntlet of ground-based weapons that could turn their ships into burning wreckage. This was why the Resistance's role was so crucial. They needed those batteries disabled, or the entire mission would fail. Signal from Dr. Vasquez, Torres announced. The Resistance teams are in position and ready to commence their attacks. Tell them to light it up, Kira ordered. Elena Vasquez crouched in the maintenance tunnel beneath the central power distribution station, listening to the sound of Admiral Voss's fleet engaging the hegemony defenses high above. Even through the reinforced concrete and steel that surrounded her, she could hear the distant rumble of weapons fire as the battle raged in orbit. Team leaders, sound off, she whispered into her communications headset. Team Alpha in position at the main power grid, came the response from Michael Santos, Maria's younger brother and a former Imperial engineer. Ready to cut power to the defense network on your signal. Team Beta standing by at the communications hub, reported Lisa Park from her position across the city. We've got eyes on the building and a clear path to the primary transmitter array. One by one, the other team leaders checked in. 17 targets throughout New Geneva, each one carefully selected to maximize disruption to the city's defensive capabilities. It had taken months of planning and reconnaissance to identify the key vulnerabilities in the hegemony's security network, and now they were about to find out if their analysis had been correct. All teams, this is Control, Elena said, using her mission call sign. Execute in 30 seconds. Remember, we only get one chance at this. She activated the timer on her wrist display and watched the numbers count down. 30 seconds to change the course of the battle. 30 seconds to prove that the Empire's people hadn't given up the fight. 10, 9, 8. Elena placed her hand on the detonator that would destroy the power station's main transformer. Around the city, 19 other resistance fighters were doing the same thing with their own targets. 3, 2, 1. Execute, she called. The explosion that destroyed the power station was small but precisely placed, severing the primary electrical feed to the planetary defense grid. Across New Geneva, similar explosions bloomed in the darkness as the resistance struck at the infrastructure that supported the hegemony's military presence. In the space of 30 seconds, half of the city's defense batteries went offline. Communication networks collapsed as relay stations were destroyed. Transportation systems ground to a halt as control centers lost power. The hegemony's carefully constructed security apparatus began to crumble like a house of cards. Elena picked herself up from the tunnel floor and activated her backup radio. Control to Admiral Voss, she called. Package delivered. The door is open. High above the planet, Admiral Kira Voss received Elena's signal just as her strike group punched through the remains of the orbital defense screen. The Resistance had done their job perfectly. Where there should have been a wall of defensive fire, there were only scattered shots from the remaining batteries. Take us down, she ordered. All ships, commence planetary assault. The convention center bunker was supposed to be impregnable. Built 300 meters below ground and protected by layers of reinforced concrete, it was designed to survive anything short of a direct hit from a planet cracker weapon. The only access was through a single heavily guarded elevator shaft that could be sealed in seconds. It was the perfect place to hide a high-value target like Thane Korath. Unfortunately for the hegemony, the bunker's designers hadn't considered the possibility that the city's maintenance workers might be part of a resistance movement. Commander Lisa Park crouched in the utility corridor that ran parallel to the bunker's main power conduit, listening to the sounds of battle echoing through the building above. The Loyalist assault had begun in earnest, and she could hear the distinctive whine of Imperial fighters strafing the convention center's roof. How much longer? She whispered to the figure working beside her. Carlos Martinez, no relation to Elena's cover identity, was a maintenance supervisor who had been secretly documenting the bunker's layout for months. He was currently disconnecting the power couplings that controlled the bunker's security systems, his hands steady despite the explosions shaking the building. "Almost there," he replied. "Just need to bypass the backup generators, and we'll have a 10-minute window before they can restore power." Lisa checked her weapon and confirmed that her tactical gear was secure. She was leading a team of 12 resistance fighters, all of them former Imperial military personnel who had somehow avoided capture during the purges. They were armed with smuggled weapons and improvised equipment, but they had the advantage of surprise and intimate knowledge of the building's layout. "Team 2, report status," she called into her radio. "In position at the elevator shaft," came the reply from Sergeant David Kim, another former Imperial soldier. "Charges are set. Ready to blow the doors on your signal." "Team 3? Security station is neutralized," reported Captain Jennifer Walsh, who had been a Special Forces officer before the fall. "We've got control of the internal surveillance system, but it won't last long." Lisa nodded and activated her chronometer. The Loyalist strike group would be landing in approximately 8 minutes, which meant they needed to have Korath in custody and ready for extraction within that time frame. "Carlos, how are we doing on those power systems?" "Done." Carlos pulled his hands back from the electrical panel and wiped sweat from his forehead. "Security grid is down for the next 10 minutes, maybe less." "Then let's move. All teams execute." The corridor erupted into controlled chaos as the resistance fighters launched their assault on the bunker. Team 2 blew the charges that destroyed the elevator doors, while Team 3 used their access to the security system to unlock the blast barriers that protected the lower levels. Within 2 minutes, Lisa and her people were rappelling down the elevator shaft toward the bunker entrance. They met their first opposition at the bunker's outer checkpoint, where 2 Hegemony Marines were trying to understand why their security monitors had gone dark. The firefight was brief and brutal. The Marines never had a chance to raise an alarm before they were gunned down. "Blast door ahead," reported Kim as they moved deeper into the facility. "Looks like they managed to seal the inner bunker before we cut power." Lisa examined the massive steel barrier that blocked their path. It was designed to withstand military-grade explosives, and forcing it open would take more time than they had. "Can we cut through it?" "Not with the equipment we brought. We need industrial cutting tools, and that would take hours." Lisa cursed silently and tried to think of alternatives. They were so close. Korath was probably less than 50 meters away, separated from justice by nothing but steel and reinforced concrete. "Wait," said Carlos, who had been studying the blast door's control panel. "There's another way. The bunker has an emergency evacuation tunnel that connects to the old subway system. If we can access it from the other end." "How far?" 2 kilometers through the underground transit network. "But there's no guarantee the tunnel isn't sealed from the inside." Lisa checked her chronometer again. 5 minutes until the Loyalist landing force arrived. Even if they moved fast, they wouldn't have time to reach the evacuation tunnel and penetrate the bunker before the extraction window closed. But then she heard it, the distinctive sound of Imperial dropships approaching the convention center. Admiral Voss had arrived ahead of schedule. "Team leaders, this is Park," she called into her radio. "Change of plans? We're going to need help from our friends upstairs." Admiral Kira Voss rappelled down the access rope from her dropship onto the roof of the convention center, her combat armor sparking as energy bolts from hegemony weapons struck the reinforced plating. Around her, 24 Imperial Marines were doing the same thing, their black uniforms and faceless helmets making them look like harbingers of doom descending from the sky. "Perimeter secure," reported Master Sergeant Jackson over the tactical network. "But we've got hegemony reinforcements moving in from 3 directions. Estimate 15 minutes before they reach the building. 15 minutes to find Korath, extract him, and escape from one of the most heavily defended systems in the galaxy." It was an impossible timeline, but Kira had stopped believing in impossible things 3 years ago when the Empire fell. "Commander Park, this is Admiral Voss," she called on the Resistance frequency. "What's your status?" "We're stuck at the bunker entrance," Lisa replied. "The blast door is sealed, And we don't have the tools to force it open. Where exactly is this bunker? 300 meters below ground level, directly beneath the main auditorium. But Admiral, there's something you should know. We've detected at least 50 hegemony personnel in the bunker complex. This isn't going to be a quiet extraction. Kira absorbed this information as her team moved through the convention center's upper levels, systematically clearing each floor of hostile forces. 50 enemy combatants in a fortified position was bad enough, but the real problem was time. Every minute they spent fighting their way through the bunker was another minute for hegemony reinforcements to surround the building. Sergeant Jackson, do we have any heavy ordnance in the loadout? Affirmative, Admiral. Brought along some bunker busters in case we needed to breach reinforced positions. How much damage are we talking about? Enough to punch through 3 meters of reinforced concrete. But in a building like this, there's a chance of bringing down the whole structure. Kira weighed the risks as her team reached the main auditorium. Below her feet, somewhere in the depths of the earth, Thane Korath was waiting under the protection of the most advanced defensive systems the hegemony could provide. Do it, she ordered. Set the charges directly above the bunker. We're going in hard and fast. The next few minutes passed in a blur of preparation and anticipation. Jackson's demolitions team placed shaped charges at strategic points throughout the auditorium floor, calculating angles and blast patterns that would channel the explosion downward into the bunker complex. Meanwhile, Kira's assault team prepared for what would essentially be a vertical siege, dropping through multiple levels of debris into a hostile environment where the enemy had every possible advantage. Charges set, Jackson reported. Ready to blow on your command. Commander Park, clear your people from the blast zone. We're coming through the roof. Understood, Admiral. We'll be waiting at the tunnel entrance. Kira activated her armor's combat systems and checked her weapon one final time. In 30 seconds, she would be leading a desperate assault into the heart of enemy territory with no backup and no possibility of retreat. It was exactly the kind of situation that had made her one of the Empire's most decorated combat commanders. All teams, prepare for breach. 3, 2, 1, execute. The explosion that tore through the convention center's foundation was like the fist of an angry god. Concrete and steel vaporized in the initial blast, while the shockwave rippled outward through the building's structure. For a moment, it seemed as though the entire building might collapse, but the architects had built better than they knew. The convention center swayed and groaned but remained standing. Kira was the first one through the breach, dropping through the smoking crater into the chaos below. Her armor's systems automatically adjusted to the low-light conditions as she landed in what had been the bunker's outer reception area. Around her, emergency lighting cast strange shadows on walls that were cracked and buckled from the explosion. Move fast, she called to her team. We've got maybe 5 minutes before this place comes down on our heads. The hegemony defenders were still reeling from the unexpected assault, but they were beginning to organize a response. Energy bolts sparked off the walls as Kira's team advanced deeper into the bunker complex, moving through corridors that were filled with smoke and debris. Contact front! Called Corporal Martinez, the team's point man. Multiple hostiles behind reinforced positions. The firefight that followed was intense but brief. The hegemony Marines were well trained and well equipped, but they had been caught off guard by an attack that should have been impossible. Within 3 minutes, Kira's team had fought their way to the bunker's central command area. And there, in a reinforced chamber behind blast-proof windows, sat the man they had come to find. Thane Korath looked older than his pictures, his silver hair now completely white, and his face lined with the stress of 3 years spent looking over his shoulder. He was dressed in the elegant robes of a hegemony governor, but his eyes held the haunted look of someone who knew that his past had finally caught up with him. Admiral Voss, he said through the intercom system, his voice carrying the same commanding presence that had once made him the most powerful man in the galaxy. I was wondering when you would come. Kira stood before the windows that separated her from her target, feeling the weight of 3 years of exile and loss pressing down on her shoulders. This was the man who had destroyed everything she had ever served, who had betrayed an entire civilization for his own personal gain. Thane Korath, she said formally. By the authority of the Loyalist government in exile, I place you under arrest for high treason against the Xerian Empire. Korath smiled sadly. The Xerian Empire is dead, Admiral. Has been for 3 years now. You're serving a ghost. Maybe. But even ghosts can demand justice. She activated the emergency release on the blast doors, and they ground slowly open. For the first time in 3 years, Admiral Kira Voss stood face to face with the man who had destroyed her world. The journey back to the Loyalist fleet was a running battle through the streets of New Geneva. Hegemony reinforcements had surrounded the convention center, and Admiral Voss's extraction team had to fight their way through multiple lines of enemy forces to reach their dropships. Thane Korath, now secured in military restraints, maintained his dignified composure even as energy bolts sparked around them. He walked between his captors with the bearing of a man who had once commanded the loyalty of 200 worlds, seemingly unaffected by the chaos erupting around him. You know this won't change anything, he said to Kira as they took cover behind an overturned vehicle. The Empire is gone. The hegemony will track you down eventually, and when they do, you'll be remembered as nothing but terrorists and pirates. History is written by the survivors, Kira replied, checking her weapon's charge level. And we're not dead yet. The dropship extraction point was 2 kilometers away through streets that had become a war zone. Hegemony forces were converging from all directions, while overhead the sounds of the space battle continued to echo through the atmosphere. Admiral Chen's sacrificial assault on the orbital defenses was buying them time, but Kira knew it couldn't last much longer. Admiral, came Master Sergeant Jackson's voice over the radio. We've got heavy armor moving in from the east. At least 6 main battle tanks with infantry support. Kira cursed silently. Their small arms were useless against military-grade armor, and they didn't have the heavy weapons needed to punch through tank plating. They were trapped between an enemy force that was growing stronger by the minute and an extraction point that might as well have been on the other side of the galaxy. That's when the Resistance made their final contribution to the mission. The explosions came from 3 directions at once, carefully placed charges that brought down 2 office buildings directly onto the advancing tank column. It was a desperate gambit that would probably bring hegemony reprisals against the civilian population, but it bought Kira's team the opening they needed. Move! She shouted, and her marines sprinted through the dust and debris toward the extraction point. They reached the dropships with barely 2 minutes to spare. The pilot was already spinning up the engines as Kira's team piled into the cargo bay, Korath still secured between 2 guards. Through the open hatch, she could see hegemony forces converging on their position from multiple directions. Go! She called to the pilot. Get us out of here! The dropship lifted off just as the first hegemony fighters arrived on the scene. Energy bolts scorched the air around them as they climbed toward the upper atmosphere, where the Loyalist fleet was fighting for its life against overwhelming odds. Signal from Admiral Chen, reported the communications officer. His battle group has taken heavy casualties, but they've managed to disable 2 of the orbital defense stations. Admiral Park's reserve formation is moving to cover our withdrawal. Through the viewport, Kira could see the distant flashes of weapons fire as the space battle raged across the system. Ships burned and died in the darkness, their crews sacrificing themselves for the chance to strike one blow against the enemy that had destroyed their civilization. How many? She asked quietly. Estimated 40% casualties across all formations. Admiral Chen's ship is among the confirmed losses. Kira closed her eyes and felt the weight of command settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. Marcus Chen had been her friend for 20 years, a colleague who had stood with her through the worst moments of the Empire's fall. Now he was gone, along with thousands of other good people who had believed in their cause. Admiral, said Korath from his restraints, you've purchased my capture with the lives of how many loyal soldiers? Was it worth it? Kira opened her eyes and looked at the man who had caused it all. Ask me again when we get to the trial. The dropship docked with the Defiance just as the Loyalist fleet began its withdrawal from the system. Around them, the surviving ships formed defensive formations while their hyperspace drives charged for the jump to safety. They had accomplished the impossible. They had penetrated one of the most heavily defended systems in hegemony space and captured their primary target. But the cost had been terrible. Nearly half the Loyalist fleet was gone, including some of their most experienced commanders and their best ships. They had traded their future as a military force for one chance at justice. As Korath was escorted to the brig, Kira made her way to the bridge and took her position in the command chair. On the main screen, the last of the hegemony reinforcements were arriving in system, but they were too late to prevent the escape. "All ships report ready for hyperspace," Torres announced. "Then take us home," Kira ordered. The stars elongated into lines of light as the Loyalist fleet jumped to hyperspace, carrying their prize back to the hidden bases where the last remnants of the Empire waited for justice to be served. The trial of Thane Korath took place 6 months later on Erebus 7, in a courtroom carved from the living rock of the asteroid's interior. Representatives from every surviving Loyalist cell attended, either in person or via holographic link, to witness the final reckoning for the man who had betrayed their civilization. Admiral Kira Voss served as the chief prosecutor, presenting evidence that had been gathered over 3 years of investigation. The charges were extensive: high treason, conspiracy with enemy forces, mass murder, and crimes against humanity. The evidence was overwhelming: recorded communications, financial records, and testimony from surviving witnesses who had seen the betrayal firsthand. Korath defended himself with the same eloquence that had once made him a beloved leader. He argued that the Empire was doomed regardless of his actions, that surrender to the hegemony had been the only way to prevent even greater bloodshed. He painted himself as a pragmatist who had made impossible choices in impossible circumstances. The tribunal was unmoved. After 3 days of testimony, they returned a verdict of guilty on all charges. "Thane Korath," read General Blackwood as she delivered the sentence, "you have been found guilty of high treason against the Xerian Empire and crimes against humanity. The tribunal sentences you to life imprisonment without possibility of parole. You will spend the remainder of your natural life in solitary confinement, with no contact with the outside world beyond your legal counsel." It was a harsh sentence, but a fair one. Many in the Loyalist movement had called for Koratha's execution, but the tribunal had chosen to demonstrate that they were still bound by the rule of law that had once made the Empire great. Korath received the sentence without emotion, standing straight and dignified even in defeat. As the guards escorted him from the courtroom, he paused to look back at Kira. "Admiral," he said quietly, "I hope you find the peace you're looking for." Kira watched him go without responding. Peace was something that seemed very far away, even with justice finally served. The news of Koratha's capture and trial spread throughout the galaxy despite the hegemony's efforts to suppress it. Resistance movements on dozens of worlds took heart from the knowledge that even the most powerful traitor could be brought to justice. The Loyalist cause, which had seemed doomed to fade into history, suddenly had new life breathed into it. But for Kira, the victory felt hollow. The Empire was still dead, its people still scattered across the galaxy as refugees and exiles. Koratha's conviction wouldn't bring back the billions who had died during the conquest, or restore the civilization that had been lost. A year later, she stood once again in the observation deck of Erebus 7, looking out at the stars that had once been part of the greatest empire in human history. General Blackwood joined her, both women older and grayer than they had been when this all began. "Any regrets?" Blackwood asked. Kira considered the question for a long moment. "About capturing Korath? No. He needed to face justice for what he did. But sometimes I wonder if we're just fighting ghosts. Maybe we are. But someone needs to remember what the Empire stood for. Someone needs to carry those values forward, even if we never see them restored. And the cost? All those people who died at Tau Ceti? They died for something they believed in. That has to count for something." Kira nodded slowly, still watching the stars. Somewhere out there, the hegemony continued to expand its dominion over the galaxy. Somewhere out there, other people were fighting for their freedom against impossible odds. And somewhere out there, the ideals of the Xerian Empire lived on in the hearts of those who refused to surrender to tyranny. It wasn't the ending she had hoped for when she first took command of the Loyalist fleet. But it was an ending she could live with. The stars wheeled in their ancient courses, indifferent to the struggles of mortals. But among those stars, the flame of freedom still burned, tended by those who remembered what had been lost and refused to let it be forgotten. The Empire was gone, but its spirit lived on. And sometimes that was enough.